Forget what other videos have told you about the US Navy escorting individual oil tankers through the dangerous Strait of Hormuz. The reason they refuse this mission has absolutely nothing to do with scuba divers attaching limpet mines in a Hollywood-style ambush. That narrative is a complete myth created to distract you from a terrifying mathematical reality about modern anti-ship ballistic missiles. We also have to face a brutal economic truth regarding the fact that the United States does not actually need the oil from this region. Right now, multi-billion-dollar US Navy destroyers are navigating the most dangerous 24 miles of water on this entire planet. But they are not there to act as personal bodyguards for civilian vessels because protecting an individual ship is a defensive trap. Today, we are going to break down the exact doctrine of strategic area denial and why the real mission of the Navy is hunting instead. If you think escorting is a simple geometry problem where you just park a billion-dollar warship next to a tanker, you are entirely wrong. The shipping lane is narrow, and threats are coming from directions that the destroyer was never built to handle simultaneously. We will decode why the most powerful warship in the world becomes a massive liability inside this narrow geographical choke point. You must forget the history of midget submarines and the basic physics of slow ships because we are stepping into an advanced battle space. Subscribe to this channel right now because the harsh military math and the unforgiving reality of modern warfare are about to begin. Here is where the advanced Aegis destroyer, the crown jewel of the surface fleet, begins to fail inside the strait. This happens not because of any flaw in its engineering, but because the local geography strips away every advantage the ship was designed to exploit. The strait is surrounded by high mountains that create what is known as a strategic area denial trap. Radar technology is essentially microwave energy that obeys the same rules as light, meaning it travels in a straight line and does not bend. If a solid object like a mountain stands between the antenna and the target, the radar beam stops dead. This creates a radar shadow where nothing exists as far as the ship sensor is concerned. Place that powerful antenna inside a strait lined with mountains, and every peak or cliff face carves a massive shadow into the radar coverage. The sensor is not broken, but the geometry of the terrain broke its physics. Let us pivot from the deadly geography of the strait and look closely at the massive vessels we are actually discussing today. A very large crude carrier, or VLCC, is the ultimate backbone of global energy transit, and it displaces up to 300,000 tons. The original narrative wants you to believe these ships are fragile containers wrapped in steel plating as thin as half an inch. This assumption is completely false, because the post-tanker war dual-hull mandates mean modern supertankers are incredibly resilient. Unlike the vulnerable vessels of the 1980s, these modern engineering marvels feature thick layers of defensive separation. A strike from a conventional weapon will cause severe localized damage, but it will absolutely not obliterate the entire vessel instantly. Regional commanders are fully aware that sinking a modern VLCC with a single explosive charge is a complete mathematical improbability. Their objective has never been to send these steel structures to the bottom of the ocean because that requires too much sustained firepower. The goal of the enemy is not to sink a massive steel ship because that is physically exhausting and tactically unnecessary for their plan. Instead, they are executing a masterclass in asymmetric economic warfare where the primary target is the global maritime insurance industry. You do not need to destroy a ship if you can raise insurance premiums so high that commercial shipping companies voluntarily halt operations. $1 billion in cargo becomes completely worthless if no civilian crew is willing to transit the dangerous waters of the narrow strait. Parking a heavily armed U.S. destroyer next to a civilian tanker does absolutely nothing to solve this massive underlying economic problem. The military might of the entire U.S. surface fleet cannot force a private corporation to risk its expensive assets in an active combat zone. The threat creates a financial blockade that is impossible to break by simply adding more defensive escort ships to the active combat zone. Asymmetric warfare lets the enemy spend pennies to paralyze supply chains while defending forces bleed massive amounts of taxpayer money. Let us take a deep dive into the actual kill chain, starting with the deployment of cheap, mobile anti-ship cruise missiles. The enemy hides these highly mobile launch platforms inside extensive tunnel networks, carved deeply into the Zagros Mountains. Radar on a destroyer operates on line of sight, which means it cannot look through solid rock to spot a hidden launch tube. By utilizing terrain masking in the coastal mountain ranges, mobile launchers remain practically invisible until the moment they fire. The interceptor margin of error collapses to single-digit seconds, because the radar shadow hides the incoming sea-skimming weapon. A cruise missile is most dangerous during its terminal phase, when its onboard seekers activate to hunt the giant steel target. This autonomous targeting capability takes the target acquisition completely out of the hands of the original human launch crew. Forcing a $2 million advanced interceptor to swat down a $20,000 weapon is a brutal war of attrition. Now we must examine the terrifying threat of anti-ship ballistic missiles and how they differ fundamentally from standard cruise missiles. A cruise missile skims the water, while a ballistic weapon arcs into the sky before dropping down at extreme supersonic terminal speeds. From a concealed launch inside a mountain tunnel to impact on a tanker hull 5 miles away, the total flight time is incredibly short. Hitting a moving vessel with a ballistic weapon is difficult, because it requires continuous eyes on target for mid-course flight guidance. This is a sophisticated capability that the regional forces severely lack without extensive foreign satellite telemetry and radar support. Once the missile enters the high-altitude phase, the local launch operators become completely blind to the moving civilian target far below. Without constant tracking, these ballistic weapons are incredibly inaccurate against commercial ships navigating the confined shipping lanes. The original video failed completely because it only viewed this conflict through a simplistic two-dimensional surface perspective. Modern naval warfare is a complex, three-dimensional battle space that heavily relies on overwhelming aerial superiority and surveillance. The United States military dominates this environment by deploying advanced AWACS aircraft and high-altitude reconnaissance drones. These powerful airborne radar platforms fly high above the Zagros Mountains to look deep into the hostile territory of the adversary. This vertical reach eliminates the terrain masking advantage by detecting the mobile missile launchers before they even open their doors. Once a launcher is identified from the sky, the American forces can instantly neutralize the threat before a missile is even fully fueled. You do not need to park a vulnerable ship in a narrow channel when you can break the entire kill chain from 30,000 feet above. This devastating aerial capability proves that individual vessel protection is an incredibly inefficient expenditure of naval combat power. The mathematical reality of modern attrition warfare makes the defensive escort strategy an incredibly foolish financial decision. An advanced Aegis destroyer relies on highly sophisticated SM-2 and SM-6 interceptor missiles to protect the local airspace. Each of these beautiful defensive interceptors costs the United States taxpayers between $2 and $4 million per launch. The regional adversary is deliberately launching cheap suicide drones that cost an absolute maximum of $20,000. You simply cannot win a prolonged conflict when you are spending millions of dollars just to intercept a cheap fiberglass toy. Sending $1 billion warship to passively escort individual civilian vessels is the exact definition of a strategic failure. The defensive posture forces the mighty U.S. Navy to constantly wait for the enemy to initiate the attack on their own schedule. This reactive strategy drains the finite magazine depth of the destroyer while leaving the cheap enemy launch platforms intact. The only mathematically sound approach is to aggressively destroy the factories and the cheap launchers before they ever fire. Let us shift our focus away from the tactical battle space and examine the broader geopolitical reality of this dangerous conflict. The most shocking truth about the Strait of Hormuz is that the United States of America does not actually need this specific oil. Domestic energy production has transformed the American economy, making the nation practically independent from this Gulf crude oil. We are witnessing a massive geopolitical paradox, where the nations that rely most heavily on this oil simply refuse to protect it. The global manufacturing engines of China and the economies of Europe are the primary consumers of this specific global energy supply. These foreign nations are acting as strategic free riders. By expecting the American taxpayers to heavily subsidize their energy security, it is completely irrational for the U.S. Navy to risk its multi-billion-dollar destroyers to secure the critical supply chain of arrival. The leaders in Washington understand clearly that fighting a grueling war of attrition here offers zero domestic economic benefit. The ultimate goal of American military power is to protect the vital interests of the homeland, rather than securing foreign trade profits. This fundamental shift in global energy dynamics explains why. The U.S. Navy is extremely reluctant to deploy a massive escort fleet. The economic burden of keeping this critical maritime artery open must finally shift to the nations that desperately need the resource. Let us summarize the absolute absurdity of deploying expensive warships to passively escort these massive tankers. The undeniable physics of the narrow strait and the brutal economics of modern attrition warfare make the strategy impossible. Sending an Aegis destroyer to protect an unarmored civilian vessel against cheap mobile missiles is a strategic disaster. You do not solve a deadly geographical choke point by sending your most valuable assets inside to simply defend and wait. You solve this complex mathematical equation by aggressively destroying the asymmetrical threats that make the waters dangerous. Every single military decision made in this region carries massive financial consequences for the entire interconnected global market. The era of the American military acting as the unconditional guardian of global maritime trade is rapidly coming to a definitive end. We must fundamentally rethink our approach to naval warfare when the technological advantage is completely erased by local geography. Future conflicts will be determined by the ability to effectively manage economic risks rather than just projecting massive firepower. The strategic area denial capabilities developed by regional actors have successfully neutralized the traditional naval escort doctrine. If you found this rigorous tactical breakdown insightful and eye-opening, then you must subscribe to our channel for more deep analysis. This brings us to the ultimate question for you to answer regarding this highly complex and dangerous geopolitical conflict. The United States relies on the Strait of Hormuz for only an extremely tiny fraction of its total domestic energy needs today. Should hardworking American taxpayers continue to massively fund the expensive protection of China and Europe's oil supply? Or is it finally time for NATO and allied partner nations to step up and boldly deploy their own expensive fleets to the Gulf? Let me know your exact military strategy and your detailed geopolitical thoughts in the comments section down below right now.